Now we want to explain why there will be pulmonary edema in left ventricular failure. Pulmonary edema is a buildup of fluid in the interstitial space between the alveoli and the capillary wall. So if in this picture you can see if this is the alveoli and this is the pulmonary capillary. So the space in between them is the interstitial space. Accumulation of fluid in this space along with the accumulation of fluid inside the alveoli is a pulmonary edema. From our previous knowledge, we know that normally the alveoli remains dry due to several factors that we have already explained. Now, if instead of being dry, there is accumulation of fluid inside the alveoli as well as the space in between the alveoli and the capillary, that is the interstitium, that is known as pulmonary edema. The question is why there will be accumulation of fluid in the alveoli or pulmonary edema in left ventricular failure. What happens in left ventricular failure? In left ventricular failure is the pump failure of the left ventricle. So left ventricle is unable to pump or expel the blood into the aorta and into the systemic circulation. So there will be accumulation of blood here in the ventricle that will give a back pressure in the left atrium. So there will be increase in pressure and volume in the atrium behind the failed ventricle, and this pressure and volume will be enhanced. Due to this increased volume and pressure in the left atrium, that will in turn give a back pressure into the pulmonary veins. We know that the oxygenated blood from the lungs, it is entering into the left ventricle via left atrium via these pulmonary veins. So the back pressure will be there into these pulmonary veins. That will affect the pulmonary circulation. In this picture we can see that there is back pressure in the atrium, and this back pressure is affecting the pulmonary capillaries. So pulmonary capillaries, in this end is the pulmonary, from this end the pulmonary veins are originating and carrying the oxygenated blood to the heart, and at this end it is the pulmonary arterial end which actually carries the deoxygenated blood. So there will be increased pulmonary capillary hydrostatic pressure due to the back pressure from the left atrium and the left ventricle. From our previous knowledge of capillary exchange, we know that the arterial end of the capillary, from the arterial end, the fluid actually moves into the interstitium and the cell, and it carries the nutrition particle and the oxygen. So this process of movement of fluid from the capillary into the interstitium is known as the filtration. So why at the arterial end of the capillary this movement happens? Because at this arterial end the hydrostatic pressure of the capillary, it is more than the oncotic pressure. Because hydrostatic pressure is the pressure that tries to move the fluid away from the capillary, whereas the osmotic pressure or the colloidal oncotic tension, it tries to draw the fluid inside the capillary. So at the arterial end, the hydrostatic pressure is around, in the systemic circulation, it is around 35 mm of mercury, whereas the oncotic pressure is 25 mm of mercury. So the difference is 10 mm of mercury, and this plus 10 mm of mercury, it facilitates the filtration. Now what happens at the venous end? We all know that at the venous end, the carbon dioxide, due to the generated by the metabolism and all these toxic particles, they will be returned back into the venous end. And this is the process of reabsorption. Why it happens? Because at the venous end of the capillary, the hydrostatic pressure, it is reduced. From 35 mm of mercury, it will become 18 mm of mercury, whereas oncotic pressure remains the same, that is 25 mm of mercury. So as the oncotic pressure exceeds the capillary hydrostatic pressure, so the inward force, it is predominant here. So there will be movement of fluid from the interstitium into the venous end. So this is the story of systemic circulation. Now we want to know what happens in the pulmonary circulation. This figure shows the interrelationship between the interstitial fluid pressure and the other pressures in the lung. Here we see this is a pulmonary capillary and this is a alveolus, and this is the interstitial space and it is drained by the lymphatic capillary. Now here first we will look after the forces. First we will look for the forces that actually helps the movement of fluid from the capillaries into the interstitial space. What are those forces? These forces are the pulmonary capillary hydrostatic pressure. It is around 7 millimeter of mercury. Other two forces which favors this filtration or movement of fluid from capillary into the interstitium are: number one is the interstitial fluid colloidal osmotic tension. So colloidal osmotic tension is that it is due to presence of some plasma proteins or some protein particles. It is actually it always tries to draw the fluid in which compartment it is belonging. So here in the interstitial space, in the interstitial fluid, the colloidal osmotic tension will also try to draw the fluid from the capillary into the interstitial space. And the amount is around 14 millimeter of mercury. So the force that is favoring the filtration, number one is the capillary hydrostatic pressure, that is around 7. Interstitial fluid colloidal osmotic tension, it is around 14. And another is that is special for this alveoli or the pulmonary circulation, it is the negative interstitial fluid pressure, it is around 8 millimeter of mercury. So 14 plus 8 plus 7, it is around plus 29 millimeter of mercury pressure that favors the movement of fluid from the capillary into the interstitium. What about the opposing force that actually prevents the movement or filtration or helps in the absorption or inward movement of fluid from the interstitium to the capillary? It is the colloidal osmotic tension of the plasma. Colloidal osmotic tension, it is 28. So the filtration force in the pulmonary capillary is 29 millimeter of mercury, and inward force that is drawing the fluid from the interstitium into the pulmonary capillary is 28 millimeter of mercury. So ultimately a minor force of plus 1 millimeter of mercury, it is actually helping the filtration force and drawing off some amount of fluid from the pulmonary capillaries into the interstitium. Now this small amount of fluid that is drawn by this plus 1 millimeter of mercury pressure will be handled by what? Will be handled by lymphatic drainage. So from this picture we can say that this plus 1 millimeter of mercury filtration pressure, it will cause a slight continual flow of fluid from pulmonary capillaries into the interstitial spaces. Except a small amount that evaporates in the alveoli, this fluid is pumped back into the circulation through the pulmonary lymphatic system. So these plus 1 millimeter of mercury pressure, positive pressure, filtration pressure will draw some amount of fluid, and lymphatic drainage is sufficient or adequate to drain this amount of fluid into the circulation. Now what happens if the hydrostatic pressure or the filtration force is higher? In the left ventricular failure, we know that there will be a back pressure in the left atrium, and this back pressure will be conveyed into the pulmonary capillaries, which will increase the hydrostatic pressure of the pulmonary capillaries. This hydrostatic pressure is the filtration force or the drawing force of fluid that will help the movement of fluid from the capillaries into the interstitium. And more fluid will be if it is coming out of the capillary. So the lymphatic pump will be unable to drain that amount of fluid into the systemic circulation. So what will happen? There will be accumulation of fluid in the interstitium, and ultimately this fluid will fill the alveoli and there will be alveolar edema or the pulmonary edema. To summarize, in left-sided heart failure, there will be decreased pumping ability of the systemic circulation, congestion and accumulation of blood in the pulmonary area, fluid leaks out in the intravascular space to the interstitium, accumulation of fluid, pulmonary edema, and it will cause several symptoms in case of left ventricular failure. I hope this video explains why there is pulmonary edema in left ventricular failure. Thank you and subscribe the channel.